Let me give the next example, which is about language and about the sounds of language. Just as understanding other minds is this deep, profound philosophical question, understanding language is a deep, hard cognitive achievement. And you can get a sense for this if you've ever just sort of sit in a cafe in a foreign country and listen to the words that are going by. It isn't just that you don't know what the words mean, it's that you don't even know what the words are. In fact, you don't even know what the sounds are. It's just, there's just this blur that's going by as you're sitting in the cafe in Italy or in France. So children not only have to figure out things like what words mean when they're starting to use language, they actually have to figure out what the relevant sounds are in their particular language. And this is a particularly difficult task because the relevant sounds are different in different languages. So in English, for example, we make a big difference between raw and law, are really relevantly different sounds. We have lots of words that are where the only difference between them is that one begins with a raw sound and one begins with a law sound. But in other languages, in Japanese, for example, there isn't any distinction between raw and law, which is why adult Japanese speakers have such a hard time mastering that distinction in English. On the other hand, in a language like Chinese, we have tone distinctions, which make an enormous amount of difference. So ba and ba can mean totally different things, and there can be 7 different bas depending on the tones that means totally different things. For us English speakers, we can't even hear the differences between those tone sounds. So different languages are actually picking up different sound distinctions to use to be meaningful in their own language. The question then becomes, how is it that babies and children are ever able to figure out how it is that these different, which set of sounds are actually going to be used in their particular language? And again, it turns out that the answer to this problem, this question, has 3 parts. When children are born, they already seem to be able to discriminate all the sounds that are ever going to be used in any of the languages of the world. So when babies are born, Japanese babies can tell the difference between raw and law. They can discriminate between one sound and the other. English-speaking babies can tell the differences between tones when they're born. So they seem to be born with this kind of repertoire of all the possible language sounds. So they seem to discriminate between pa versus ba and so forth. However, as babies are getting older, they seem to start picking up which sounds are actually going to be important in their own particular language. So that if you test 9-month-olds, the Japanese-speaking 9-month-olds already are not paying attention to raw and law anymore. Even though they could discriminate between those sounds when they were little, when they were born, by the time they're a year old, they're already starting to ignore those sounds. The English-speaking babies are already starting to ignore the sound differences that aren't going to be important in English. Now think about that. These are 9-month-olds, so they're not even talking yet. They're not actually using any words themselves yet. And yet you can see that they're already picking up something about which sounds are actually going to be important in their own languages. Babies also, by the time they're 9 months old, again, before we even think of them as talking at all, are picking up the intonation pattern of their particular language. So if you listen to babies babbling, Swedish babies sort of babble in Swedish, and English-speaking babies babble in English. So the Swedish babies sound sort of like the Swedish chef on the Muppets. You know, they're sort of going, and you've all seen an English-speaking baby, you know, a 1-year-old picking up a book or a newspaper and going, so the babies already seem to have picked up something about the fact that the sound system of their language is different from the sound system of other languages. And again, they seem to have done that just completely spontaneously, even before we think of them as officially talking at all. Well, so they seem to have these learning capacities. The third part, and this is particularly dramatic in the case of language sounds, is that babies are also using information from other people to sort out language sounds. And in this case, the phenomenon that's most striking is something that linguists call motherese. And motherese is that special language that we all use when we're talking to babies. So when you turn to your baby and you just go, "Oh, you are my baby, aren't you? You are my sweet baby, aren't you? You are my..." I've given this talk, you know, dozens and dozens of times, and I blush every time I do this. I think about, you know, this talk is sticking out your tongue in public and then talking motherese in public. It's an exercise in embarrassment. And nevertheless, all of us do this completely spontaneously when we're faced with a baby. Not just moms do it, but fathers and grandfathers and You can hear 2-year-olds actually saying, "Oh, aren't you a sweet baby?" when they're talking to their, 3-month-old baby sisters. And it turns out to be a really good thing that we do all do this, because it turns out that completely unconsciously, this motherese, this special kind of language that we use, is serving as a teaching tool for babies to actually be able to learn language. The first thing is that we can show that babies prefer to listen to motherese. Motherese is kind of pulls out, is like a kind of siren call for little babies. So if you do one of those experiments where you have 2 loudspeakers on either side of the cradle, and you play motherese in at one ear and just regular adult-directed speech in the other ear, babies will turn to listen to motherese, even turn to listen to motherese that's in another language. So there's something about the high pitch and the exaggerated contours and the funny sounds of motherese that seems to just capture the baby's attention right away. But not only does motherese capture the baby's attention, motherese also seems to actually give the baby information about the sounds of language. So when you do an acoustical analysis of motherese, it turns out that in motherese, we exaggerate those differences between ra and la, or the differences between the tones. So you can actually hear the differences in the sounds much more vividly if you hear them in motherese than you can if you hear them in adult-directed speech. And there's some evidence that babies hearing motherese actually manage to appreciate these language distinctions better than if they're just hearing regular adult-directed speech. There's even some evidence that adult second language learners can pick up the sounds of language better if they hear them in motherese than if they hear them in adult-directed speech. I'm not quite sure that we could get, Berlitz to have their people saying, "Oh, you are a sweet baby, aren't you?" But it might be that you can learn better. You can learn better that way anyway. That may be part of the old advice which my son took up when he was in China, which is the best way to learn a foreign language is to get a girlfriend who actually is a native speaker of the language. Maybe that's because the girlfriends are talking motherese all the time. So we're actually using the sounds of we're actually using motherese. Motherese is actually giving us the information that we need, giving babies just the information they need about the sound structure of language. And again, this is something that we do completely spontaneously without thinking about it, just as part of our everyday life. Okay, so there's the details about motherese. Oh, and a last thing about motherese is that it turns out that motherese is actually different in different languages. So that mothers who are speaking English actually will use a form of motherese that exaggerates the differences in English. Mothers who are speaking Chinese or Swedish will use a form of motherese that exaggerates the sound differences in Chinese or Swedish. So again, completely unconsciously, mothers seem to be adjusting their motherese so that it's giving the babies just the information that they're going to need for their particular language system. So this completely everyday, commonplace, embarrassing thing turns out to be this incredibly powerful teaching tool at the same time. Okay, so that's a second example, language sounds where babies know a lot, learn a lot, and are taught a lot by other people.